My sister didn't come to a single chemo session after the third one. She didn't come for the surgery, or the hospice nurse's first home visit, or the night I called her at 2 in the morning because Mom's oxygen machine wouldn't stop alarming, and I couldn't tell if it was the machine failing or her lungs. Renee showed up 11 days after the funeral instead, sat down across from me in our family attorney's office, folded her hands on the table like she'd rehearsed it in the car, and said, "I think we need to talk about how you handled Mom's money at the end." She said it like she already knew how the story would end. She had no idea our mother had answered that exact question 8 years earlier, in that same office, on a recording nobody but our attorney knew existed. My name is Dana Marsh. I'm 40, and for the last 11 years I've worked as a hospice case manager, which means I've sat in more living rooms during the last week of somebody's life than most people sit in during an entire career. I thought that job had already taught me everything grief could do to a family. It hadn't shown me yet what grief does to the people in a family who weren't actually grieving. They were waiting. Welcome back to Dark Revenge, the channel for stories where nobody raises a fist and somebody still loses everything that matters to them. This is where we cover the quiet ones, the toxic mothers-in-law, the golden child siblings, the husbands who think a smile covers a lie, and how the truth eventually catches every single one of them without anybody needing to scream. If you're the kind of person who's ever kept the receipts while somebody else kept the good reputation, this is exactly your kind of story. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, and stick around, because the reveal in the middle of this one is the reason people keep coming back to this channel. Subscribe now and you'll get a story exactly like this one every week. Calm women, loud liars, and the truth arriving right on schedule. I live in Cedar Falls, Pennsylvania, a town of about 9,000 people built along a river that used to run 3 textile mills and now mostly runs kayaks in July. I grew up 2 streets over from where I live now, in a narrow house on Blaine Avenue with green shutters my father painted the summer before he died. My husband, Sam, teaches shop class at the high school. We have 2 kids, Wyatt and Louisa, 11 and 8, and a rescue mutt named Biscuit who is inexplicably terrified of the vacuum cleaner. Most days my job is unremarkable in the way good work usually is. I check oxygen levels. I sort pills into a weekly planner. I sit with families and tell them, as gently as I know how, what the next 2 days will probably look like. I am, by every account including my own, a fairly steady, fairly unremarkable person, and I liked it that way. My mother, Evelyn Marsh, was never unremarkable. She ran Marsh Fabric and Notions on Sycamore Street for 26 years, a narrow shop that smelled like new cotton and drip coffee, where half the wedding dresses and every 4-H quilt in the county got their fabric at some point. She retired at 65, kept the building, and leased the space to a coffee shop that still calls itself Evelyn's on the awning out front, which she found endlessly funny every single time she drove past it. She lived alone on Blaine Avenue since my father, Walter, died of a heart attack behind the wheel of his delivery truck 11 years ago, 2 blocks from the hardware store he'd run his whole adult life. She was 71 when the story starts. Sharp as anything. Still drove herself to church. Still beat me at gin rummy more often than I'd like to admit. Still called me at 4 o'clock every Sunday afternoon without fail for as long as I can remember. My sister, Renee, lives about 40 minutes away outside Harrisburg, married to a realtor named Brad Colton, whose face is currently on a sign at 3 intersections in that town. Renee posts often, beach trips, kitchen renovations, a caption under nearly every photo about gratitude and family first. On paper, we were close. In practice, by the time the story starts, Renee and I spoke maybe once a month, and it was almost always me who called, almost always about our mother. To understand why none of what came later surprised me quite as much as it should have, you need to understand how Renee and I grew up, because it left a shape neither of us ever talked about directly, but both of us lived inside of. Renee is 2 years younger than me. When she was 6, she was diagnosed with a kidney condition that meant 2 surgeries and years of specialist visits 40 miles away, and for a long stretch of our childhood, my mother's whole nervous system seemed to orbit around her. I don't say that with any resentment now. A mother should worry about a sick child. But somewhere inside those years, a habit set in that never fully broke afterward. Renee was the one who needed watching. I was the one who could be counted on. I remember being 12 years old, at my own birthday dinner, when my mother had to leave the table twice to take calls about Renee's follow-up appointment, And I remember telling her it was fine, actually meaning it, and my mother squeezing my shoulder and saying, "You're so mature, Dana. I don't worry about you." I didn't understand until I was much older that being told you're the one nobody has to worry about is its own quiet kind of being overlooked. By the time we were teenagers, that had calcified into something simple and lopsided. Renee got noticed for showing up. I got noticed for not needing to be noticed. I paid my own way through nursing school with loans and a job at a gas station on Route 22, pulling overnight shifts so I could study during the slow hours between midnight and 5. When Renee got married at 26, my mother paid for the wedding outright, $28,000, a number I wouldn't actually learn for years. At the time, I only knew it was handled. 2 years earlier, when Sam and I got married, my mother told me gently that there wasn't extra money that year, and I said it was fine, and I meant that too, because by then I'd already learned our family's real language. We didn't ask for things. We did things, quietly, and told ourselves that eventually the people who did the work would be seen for it. I believe that the way you believe a fact you've never actually had to test. Everything changed on a Tuesday morning in March, roughly 2 years before she died, when my mother called me at 11 a.m. on a weekday instead of 4 o'clock on a Sunday, which was already strange enough that I stepped out of a patient's room to take it. She'd had a scan for stomach pain she'd been blaming on bad tacos for 6 weeks. It wasn't tacos. It was pancreatic cancer, stage 3, and the oncologist in Hershey gave her, in the careful, rounded language doctors learned to use, somewhere between 8 and 18 months. I'd like to tell you I handled that news like the professional I've spent 11 years becoming. I didn't. I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage in Hershey and cried in a way I hadn't since my father's funeral, and then I wiped my face with a fast food napkin from the glove compartment, because I had a mother to drive home, and driving her home felt like the only useful thing left to do with my hands. Renee cried too over the phone for a long time and said every right thing there was to say. She'd come every weekend. She'd help with appointments. She'd take leave from work if it came to that. For about 6 weeks, she almost did. She came to 2 chemo sessions and brought a fruit basket roughly the size of a tire and posted a photo of herself holding our mother's hand in the infusion chair with a caption about strength and family that collected over 400 likes. Then the visits got shorter, then less frequent. Then they turned into phone calls where I could hear a blender running or a car door slamming in the background while she talked, her voice going thin and distracted in a way I recognized from 100 other families I'd worked with, the sound of someone who has already decided, somewhere underneath the words, that this isn't really going to be their job. By month 4, I was the one driving Mom to every appointment, refilling every prescription myself, sitting through every scan result in a paper gown chair that had started to feel like a second desk. I didn't mind the actual work. I minded quietly that nobody outside that room seemed to know it was happening. But I told myself Renee had 2 kids and a full-time job and a life 40 minutes away, and I let it go, the way I'd let so many things go before, because letting it go had always been the family's real currency. My mother turned 71 about 5 months into treatment, and Renee organized the dinner herself that year, which I remember being genuinely grateful for at the time. She booked the back room at the Cedar Falls Inn, ordered a cake from a bakery 40 minutes away instead of the one on Main Street Mom actually liked better, and arrived 20 minutes early to hang balloons along the window. She also brought a guest none of us expected, a man named Christopher Doyle, introduced as just a friend from Brad's Golf League who happened to be passing through. He was pleasant enough, good posture, better teeth, the kind of easy charm that fills a room without anyone quite noticing how much space it's taking up. About halfway through the salad course, Christopher turned to my mother, entirely conversational, and asked whether she'd updated her since my father passed, and whether the house on Blaine Avenue was still just in her name. My mother, tired from a chemo cycle 2 days earlier and flattered by the direct attention of a stranger, answered him plainly, the way she'd have answered anyone who asked her something at her own birthday table. I caught my husband Sam's eye across the room. Neither of us said anything. It felt petty to make something of it in the moment, at a birthday dinner, over cake. That's the thing about small wrong notes. They're built to be dismissed in real time. It's only later that you go back and count how many of them there actually were. Renee's gift to Mom that night was a slim leather portfolio, the kind you'd slide a resume into. Inside was a single form, already partly filled out, that Renee described as just paperwork for the insurance company, in case you get too tired to deal with things. Nothing. Really, it just names me as backup. My mother, exhausted, reached for the pen sitting by the cake. I leaned over, kept my voice easy, and said, "Mom, let's have Mr. Whitmore's office look over anything with your name on it before you sign. You taught me that yourself. Always read the fine print twice." My mother laughed and said I was probably right and set the pen down. Renee's smile didn't move an inch, but something behind her eyes did. She slid the portfolio back into her bag without another word about it, and for the rest of the dinner she was warm and funny and perfectly normal, which, looking back, was its own kind of tell. I didn't think much more about that night until about 6 weeks later, sorting my mother's mail while she napped on the couch, when I found an envelope from a firm called Doyle and Pruitt, addressed to her personally. Inside was what the letter called a consultation summary, thanking her for our recent conversation regarding estate planning options, dated the week after that birthday dinner. My mother had no memory, when I asked her that evening as gently as I could, of any conversation with anyone named Doyle. "Maybe your sister mentioned him to somebody," she said, and went back to her crossword, and I let it sit because I still didn't want to be the daughter who manufactured something ugly out of a birthday party. A few weeks after that, helping her organize a box of old bills, I found a spiral notebook she kept since before I was born, grocery totals, fabric orders, little notes to herself in the margins. Near the back, on a page from about 8 years earlier, was a single line in her own handwriting. "Renee, house down payment advance, $42,000, count against her share." I hadn't known the exact number before. I'd known there was help. I hadn't known my mother had quietly kept score of it in her own hand, years before either of us had any reason to think it would ever matter. Around the same time, doing dishes together one evening, my mother mentioned, almost as an aside, "Your sister already took care of that thing with the bank, so don't worry about it." When I asked what thing, she looked briefly confused, then waved it off and blamed her chemo brain, which by then was a documented and very real side effect our oncology team had warned us about more than once. I didn't push her that night. I wrote the date down instead, in a notebook I'd started keeping without fully admitting to myself yet why I was keeping it. Then, near the end of month 9, my mother was hospitalized overnight for a bowel obstruction, a common enough complication with her diagnosis. I stayed the first night. Renee stayed the second, insisting she wanted her turn, which touched me at the time. It was only a week later, when a nurse I knew from cross-coverage mentioned in passing that your sister asked us for copies of your mom's insurance summary and account statements for her file, that the touched feeling curdled into something colder. Hospitals don't hand out account statements. They don't keep them. Whatever Renee had actually been asking for, it wasn't paperwork the hospital had any business giving her. I want to be honest about why I started keeping records, because it matters to the rest of this. It wasn't revenge, not at that point, not even close. Charting is simply what I do. It's the entire architecture of my job. I log vitals. I log medications. I log conversations with families, because in hospice care memory is unreliable and paper is not. So somewhere around month 10 of my mother's illness, without any grand plan behind it, I started a binder for her the way I'd start one for any patient. Every appointment, every medication change, every phone call from Renee and every missed one, every strange comment my mother made and then forgot 5 minutes later, dated and initialed the way I'd chart in a patient's file. I photographed the ledger page. I slid the Doyle and Pruitt letter into a plastic sleeve behind it. I didn't know yet what any of it would matter for. I only knew that the shape of things had changed, and the one tool I'd ever fully trusted in an uncertain situation was documentation. I also did something I had never once done in 11 years of caring for other people's families. I asked for help with my own. I called Grace Whitmore, whose office sits above what used to be the Five and Dime on Sycamore Street, 3 doors down from where my mother's old shop still stands, and who has known our family since before I was born. I laid it all out for her, the portfolio at the birthday dinner, the Doyle letter, the ledger entry, the bank comment my mother didn't remember making, the strange request from the hospital stay. Grace listened the way good lawyers listen, without much visible reaction, and then she told me something that reshaped the entire size of my worry. "Your mother already has an estate plan in place," she said carefully, folding her hands on the desk. "Parts of it I drafted for her personally years ago. I can't tell you what's in it while she's alive. That's hers to share, not mine, but I can tell you this much. Your mother came to me on her own, long before any of this illness, and she was thinking further ahead than either of you probably realizes. I asked her, half joking and half not, whether I should be worried on Renee's behalf. Grace looked at me over the top of her reading glasses for a long moment before she answered. I think your mother has spent longer preparing for this exact conversation than either of her daughters has. If you've ever had that specific cold realization that a parent has quietly been protecting themselves from someone you love, and you don't yet know from what exactly, stay with me, because this is where the story turns. And if this is exactly the kind of story that keeps you up watching one more video, drop a single word in the comments. Watching. It tells me more than you'd think, and it's the reason this channel keeps making them. My mother died on a Thursday morning in October, 20 months after that first phone call, at home, in the bed by the window she'd specifically asked for because it looked out at the maple tree my father planted the year they bought the house. I was holding her hand. Priya, the hospice nurse I'd worked alongside for years, and who now sat on the other side of my own mother's bed, told me afterward that it had been one of the most peaceful deaths she'd witnessed in 15 years of doing this work, which is a strange thing to feel grateful for. But I was entirely. The funeral was at First Presbyterian on 4th Street, where my mother had sung alto in the choir for 3 decades. The pews were full, old customers from the shop, half the hospice team I worked with, neighbors from Blaine Avenue going back to when I was a child. Renee arrived 45 minutes late, in a black dress I recognized from one of her vacation photos, and cried, beautifully and audibly, through the entire service, 3 people down from me in the front pew. I don't say that to be cruel. I think some of it was genuine. Grief and performance aren't always different rooms. Sometimes they're the same room with different lighting. 11 days later, Renee called and asked to meet at Grace Whitmore's office to go over things. I sat down across from her, and before either of us had said one real word about our mother, Renee folded her hands on the table and said the line I opened this whole story with. I think we need to talk about how you handled Mom's money at the end. I've talked to Christopher, and he thinks there are some real questions about her state of mind this past year and about how much control you had over things. I remember the particular quiet that dropped over that office. I didn't raise my voice. I asked her, evenly, what exactly she thought I'd done. She didn't have a clean answer, only a collection of implications stitched together, that I'd lived close by, that I'd managed Mom's pill planner and her checkbook those last months as her documented informal payee, that chemo and grief made people, not fully themselves, that maybe, just maybe, decisions made in that condition shouldn't be allowed to stand as written. 3 weeks later, a formal letter arrived from Doyle and Pruitt on my sister's behalf, contesting our mother's will and demanding a full accounting of the estate, citing undue influence and diminished capacity in her final year of life. I won't pretend those weeks were easy. I lay awake more nights than I can count doing the same math over and over. How much a contested estate could cost in legal fees alone, whether I might actually lose the house I just started calling mine, whether 20 months of driving my mother to appointments could somehow be recast, on paper, as something sinister. Sam found me in the kitchen at 1 a.m. with the caregiving binder spread across the table, and he didn't try to talk me out of the fear. He just sat down across from me and started reading through it page by page, patient and unhurried, until the sun came up. You documented every single day of this, he said finally. Whatever happens, that's not nothing. It wasn't hope exactly. It was something steadier than hope. It was the specific comfort of knowing I hadn't been careless, even in the parts of my life I never expected anyone to examine this closely. Grace called me back into her office the week after that letter arrived. She'd spent the intervening weeks pulling records under the authority the estate now gave her, and what she'd found rearranged the entire picture, one piece at a time. The first thing she slid across the desk was a letter from Third National Bank's fraud department, dated about 7 months before my mother died. The same thing with the bank, she'd mentioned once, confused over the dishes. The bank had flagged and declined 3 separate attempts to access funds from my mother's checking account using an old joint signer authorization from years earlier, one my mother had formally revoked right after Renee's wedding, when she closed that authorization down to her own name only. All 3 attempts, the letter showed in plain black type, had originated from Renee. The second thing was the Doyle and Pruitt consultation summary, the one I'd found in the mail. Cross-referenced with billing records Grace had subpoenaed, it turned out Christopher Doyle had actually met with Renee alone, twice, in the 2 months before that birthday dinner, to discuss, in his own firm's language, strategies regarding a future estate distribution. The letter addressed to my mother appeared to be an attempt to create a paper trail, suggesting she herself had requested the meeting, when in fact she'd never met the man before that dinner. The third was the ledger page. Grace confirmed what I'd already begun to suspect. My mother had come to her that same year in writing, formally memorializing the $42,000 figure as an advancement against Renee's future share, with Renee's own signature acknowledging it on file, a signature Renee herself, judging by her reaction when Grace later mentioned it, had genuinely forgotten she'd ever given. Grace explained the mechanics of it to me, plainly, the way she explains everything. Because Renee's own filing had put our mother's mental state and financial handling directly at issue, it opened the door, under the law, to exactly the kind of formal accounting Renee's letter had originally demanded, except now it ran in both directions. Grace subpoenaed bank records for the full 18 months in question. She requested Doyle and Pruitt's own billing logs under a formal discovery request Christopher's own firm was legally obligated to answer. Nothing about it was dramatic in the moment. It was closer to watching someone quietly count something a second time, out loud, until the number came out different than the first person had claimed. Each piece on its own might have passed as an odd coincidence. Stacked together on Grace's desk, they stopped being coincidences and became a pattern. One my mother, I understood with a fresh, slower kind of sorrow, had been quietly documenting and defending herself against for years before any of us ever said the word cancer out loud. Grace told me there was one more thing, and that this one, unlike the bank letter and the ledger, had been sitting sealed for exactly this moment. 8 years earlier, 2 years after Renee's wedding, the same year as that ledger entry, my mother had come to Grace's office alone without telling either of us and asked her to set up an irrevocable trust. Grace had insisted, given the family dynamics my mother described even then, on a formal competency evaluation from Dr. Adiz Okafor, my mother's physician of over 20 years, confirming full mental capacity, dated and signed that same week. His note, when Grace pulled the file, was 2 sentences long and entirely unambiguous. Patient presents with full orientation to person, place, time, and situation. No evidence of cognitive impairment affecting decision-making capacity. 2 sentences, written 8 years before any diagnosis anyone could have used to argue otherwise. Grace had done one more thing that day, something she told me she only does for a handful of clients a year, the ones she genuinely worries might face exactly this kind of fight down the road. She had recorded my mother, on video, stating in her own words why she was structuring the trust the way she was. Grace played it for me, on a laptop turned sideways on her desk. My mother looked younger, steadier, her hair still fully her own color, sitting in the same chair I'd been sitting in for weeks without knowing it. She said the date out loud at the start, the way Grace had coached her to. She said she loved both her daughters, and she meant it. You could hear that she meant it. Then she said, plainly, without a trace of anger in her voice, that she'd watched money and attention move toward one daughter for most of that daughter's life, that she'd let it happen more than she should have, and that she wanted to leave something behind that couldn't be argued with later. Something dated, something recorded, something that would still be true, no matter who tried to rewrite it after she was gone. The trust held far more than either of us knew existed. 9 years before her diagnosis, my mother had quietly sold the building that used to house her fabric shop, the one she still owned even after retiring, the one she'd let a coffee shop lease, for $310,000, and had moved every dollar of it into that trust without ever mentioning the sale to either daughter. Renee had grown up assuming that building was just something sentimental mom still owned. It had actually been the single largest asset in the entire estate, sitting untouched and unmentioned for 9 years, specifically because it wasn't in the house, wasn't in the checking account, and wasn't anywhere an old joint authorization or anyone's charm could ever reach it. And the trust had one more feature, which Grace described in her flattest legal voice as about as strong a no-contest clause as I've ever personally drafted. Any beneficiary who formally challenged the trust or the will and lost would forfeit their remaining share entirely, not to me, but into a locked education account for Renee's own 2 children, administered directly by the bank's trust department, untouchable by Renee for any reason, waiting quietly for her kids until they each turned 18. I sat in Grace's office for a long moment after the video ended, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something closer to a fresh layer of grief for a woman who'd spent 8 years quietly building a wall around herself, alone, without ever once telling either of her daughters that she'd felt she needed one.